Peter 3, 1 through 7, and I'm going to read from the NIV. Wives, in the same way, submit yourself to your husbands, so that, if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words, but by behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
I want everyone to know that Hope reading that was not intentional. Even though every day, the second she wakes up, I ask her to submit to me. That was not the intention. All right, let me get set up here first. We're going to have probably same or similar technical issues as we had last week. I apologize. I really can't figure out what's going on with our laptop. If you are someone who is wanting to give away a MacBook, you let me know and we'll talk. We are in the section of 1 Peter where we are continuing to deal with some pretty tough passages of Scripture. They're real. They've been used in some really interesting ways. They're difficult. They've been misinterpreted. Stephen did a great job last week in talking about masters and servants and the household codes and all of these things to kind of really drive home Peter's desire to take these households that were really uncritically leaning into the household or to the codes of Rome and the laws of Rome and just doing what they'd always learned and putting them under the authority of Christ. And it's a good thing. Each person individually. And Peter is doing this as a result of a very practical question. And it's a question that still lingers with us. It's a question we have to answer. Peter is asking, how would Jesus have lived in first century Rome? Right? He lived in a very specific moment of time, in a very specific place. He doesn't know what it was like to be a husband or a father or a master or a slave. He didn't experience that in actuality. He experienced everything that we experience as humans, but like Peter's trying to figure out then, so what do we do with the example of Jesus in the midst of the things that we are experiencing? Unique circumstances. He doesn't know what it's like to be a dad in 2024 or a pastor or any of the questions I'm asking. Like, how do we do this? He never had to interact with social media. He never had to do anything with technology, right? Like, what are we trying to do here, trying to figure all of this out? So, what's interesting about that is that Peter is still very unrelenting in saying that Jesus is still our example for life in everything, right? The context, in some ways, matters a ton and doesn't matter at all, right? And that's the tension that we're trying to hold. And so today's passage is about marriage. Marriage. It's what brings us together today. It is this covenant relationship between husbands and wives. The Bible has a lot to say about all relationships. And the primary reason for that is because relationships are one of the main vehicles through which God's love is meant to be displayed in the world, right? If you actually read the Sermon on the Mount, one of the misconceptions through history is that it's supposed to be a code of personal ethics. Like, this is how I live. And what's cool in recent biblical scholarship that's happening is that people are seeing this as a code of community ethics. This is how we choose to live together as a community. Let's see what the results are going to be, right? They are primary relational. And what that means is when your relationships are, for the most part, right, your life's probably going to be pretty good, right? It's a good thing. So when we find out that in Genesis, just for an example, the we of the Trinity decided to share their abundance through the act of creation and making the earth, it is an expression first and foremost of love. And then when they look at Adam and they say it is not good for him to be alone, they're acknowledging that same thing. Something is missing here. Let's create community. The same thing we experience. Or in the New Testament, you have all these one another's, right? There's like more than 50 of them. You've got love one another, honor one another, greet one another, welcome, show hospitality, be at peace, be kind to one another. We're made as relational creatures. This is a primary concern. And so for marriage in particular, we have to start out just acknowledging that it's one of two vocational options in the New Testament. You've got two. The first one, can you guess, if marriage is the second one, can you guess what the first one is? Singleness is the first vocation that all of us get to figure out. We don't usually think about them as vocations, but the reason the language of vocation matters is because it has to be mastered with a particular set of emotional realities and skills. Like it's a real thing. And so when we don't talk about singleness as a vocation and taking that seriously, which the church does not typically, we usually just see singleness as a pathway to marriage, and then you're not normal or like something until you get married or you figure that out, right? It's the same thing as if you were a teacher and you wanted to transition to be a lawyer, right? If you're a good teacher, but if you learn no skills on how to be a lawyer, you will be a bad lawyer. You will not be good at it, right? You could be a lawyer, but nobody would hire you, right? You have to go through education, formation. You have to figure out how all this works. And that's actually the same from moving from singleness to marriage. You have to learn an entirely different set of skills, right? You have to learn an entire new mainframe. Your brain has to change about how you think about these things. And to the degree that you kind of like resist that or really are not guided through it, you're going to be kind of miserable if you try to keep living a single life into marriage. That's not going to be a good time for anybody, right? So the vocation language matters, and the New Testament is serious about it. By the way, Paul's preference seems to be in service to God that you would not get married. Just to give weight to that, right? Like, I know we consider marriage as a no-brainer, but there is so much honor in singleness that we need to continue to bring forward and push up in people who are making that choice, not as like there's something wrong with them, right? Next page. Let's talk about the vocation of marriage and see what hits us today. So I want to start out by putting the two main verses that we see here, one to husbands, one to wives, up on the screen. We'll see if it gets there. But so we've got wives and we've got husbands. Okay? Wives are addressed in 3:1, husbands are addressed in 3:7. So here's what Peter says to wives. He says, wives, which is a great way to address a group of people. That's how I talk to my wife. I yell wife at her. Wives, in the same way, you submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. Good. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. I also often call my wife a weaker vessel. Whenever she tries to do something I know she can't do, it's good. I want to point to this highlighted portion. In the same way, right? This is the beginning of the chapter, and so we have to ask the question, what does he mean in the same way? He's actually referring back to Stephen's passage in 1 Peter 2:18 when he's talking to slaves and masters. He says, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourself to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. So when he says that in the same way, he's saying in reverent fear of God is supposed to be a motivator for both husbands and wives to do these actions, to like live in harmony with one another, in reverent fear of God. Let's pause for a second. I'm going to be very honest with you. While fear does motivate me to do some stuff that I don't want to do, it does not often motivate me to do things that I want to do, like love my wife well. I do not often love my wife well because I'm afraid of God and like that he's gonna hit me. Some people are wired that way. I'm not wired that way. And it just makes me ask a lot of questions. For me, they don't quite go together. And so here's what I would just push forward to you just as an example of how I think about these things. The English word for fear is really not the best translation of the biblical concept of fear of God. Has anyone ever wondered about that? Like in Proverbs, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And I was like, everything I know would say that fear and wisdom don't seem to usually actually go hand in hand, unless that thing is like a snake. It is wise to be afraid of a snake, but like everything else about the New Testament seems to acknowledge this God who wants to be close and with us, right? But you can't do that with fear. That's because in the 21st century, fear has taken on a new dynamic that's actually much closer to panic, right? That's much closer to mindlessness, like get away. It's the fight, flight, or freeze, right? Or fawn is the new one, actually, where you give in. And that's not what I think they're going for, right? It's something akin to death. I don't think that's how it's being talked about here. And I'm going to bring up a quote by another author who is closer to them, Aristotle. And this is what he says. The fear which virtuous and honorable sons feel towards their fathers, and citizens toward right-minded rulers, has for its companions reverence and modesty. But the other kind, the kind that we probably experience more day to day in the 21st century, felt by slaves for masters and by subjects for despots who are just totalitarian or like terrible rulers, who treat them with injustice or wrong, the product is associated always with hostility and hatred, right? So there are two kinds of fear here. And as you might imagine, the fear that he is talking about, at least that we say, is closer to this reverence and modesty, right? Reverent love. We can't say this enough in these 2 weeks, okay? Stephen said it really well last week. We cannot say this enough. If you are less than impressed with women and slaves on the surface being told to be afraid in the way that we understand it, that is a good instinct. You should read that and be like, that doesn't seem quite right, right? Therefore, you have to submit because you're a scared slave. That's the move. Submit. Like that's maybe not, or like you're a woman with no power in first century Rome. Here's the answer: submit. It's like, oh, okay. If that doesn't seem right to you, your curiosity should be piqued. That's a good instinct because this is not what Peter is trying to communicate. He's not justifying injustice, where those with power can do whatever they want to those without power. He's instead talking about this word reverence. This is what he's talking about with this fear. Out of reverence for God, wives, submit to your husbands. Out of reverence for God, husbands, treat your wives with respect and with all due as co-heirs. Deep respect, awe, and love. It's appreciation. It is wonder at the mystery of God. This is our response. It is a call back, actually, the picture that they're trying to get at. It's a call back to when you were a kid and you would look at your parents and they were like the most interesting, weird, mysterious figures of your life. Does anyone have any inkling of that memory? Of just like you would look at your parents and you thought they knew everything. They were the most powerful people in the world. And there was a love there, but there was also like, and I don't understand you. And then, of course, we all hit adulthood and we go, oh, you're just a human. And I don't know how I feel now. That's just like, that's how it happens for all of us, right? But you were in awe. And awe is in short supply for us in the present day and age. But it is actually pretty central to our discipleship with God, trying to figure out how he relates to us. It feels a little bit alien. But here's what I want to say. If you look at this, the call for husbands to submit to their wives is out of reverent love for God, as well as servants for masters and husbands for wives. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. And to each of these groups, Peter, what he's doing is he is toppling your instinctual power structure for each one of them of how they should be trying to live their life. So, now servants do not take their masters as their authority and their example for character. Actually, who gets replaced instead of the master? It's Jesus. Jesus is now the example. For wives, it is no longer their husband, regardless of what Rome says or what the norms are. It's no longer the husband who is their ruler and their example. It is Jesus. He's placing Jesus very firmly there. And for husbands, instead of whatever the norms are, what their friends are doing or whatever, instead of that being their controlling factor, it is Jesus. Jesus is the example. He is the one who has authority over the whole household now, toppling each and every one. Boom, 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 like dominoes. And what you get when all three of those are actually in line, it sounds actually pretty cool. You would have a group of people, all of whom are going after the character of Jesus, even in the midst of very difficult situations and even in the midst of injustice. That sounds like actually a pretty great idea. Instead of all three of these groups doing what they want, they lay down their rights to rebellion. They lay down their rights to condemnation, to deceit, to power grabbing. And really, what is the ultimate heresy of our day in the 21st century? You lay down your right to what is fair, right? Like, that's not fair. They shouldn't be able to treat me this way. They shouldn't be able to blah, 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 right? The whole thing. And I feel that. But we lay all of that down because we're trying to get to what Peter talks about for Jesus in 1 Peter 1, starting in verse 22. This was the example. Remember this. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps, right? He committed no sin. He never deceived anyone. And when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that you might die to sins and live for righteousness, because by his wounds you have been healed. And so the acknowledgement that Peter is saying for all these people is that nobody knows what it's like to face injustice or unjust situations more than Jesus did. And yet, what was his example in the midst of it? Quiet, reverent fear of God in submission to what was happening. And that is so difficult. It is such a hard thing. I would say it's probably one of the hardest examples in the New Testament in terms of how Peter lays this out. Because it is not easy to choose to lay down your rights or what you think is fair or what should be the case. That is not an easy thing. It takes supernatural discernment also to figure out when it's time to push back. When you say, no more, I'm not doing this any longer, right? Or to create the boundaries or those sorts of things. But we do that probably in our flesh maybe too quickly, too easily, instead of learning the lesson. So for example, just very bluntly, this passage in particular has a horrific history to justify staying in marriage where, for example, like physical abuse has occurred, right? Like this has been used over and over and over and over again to justify, like, you need to go back, pastors with women in the room, like, you need to go back to your husband and you need to show him by your meekness of faith that like he can be drawn back in. That is not the move, okay? Unless the Spirit is leading her in particular. Like, that is not the thing, right? That's not great. When you read this contextually, you find out pretty quickly, even in 60 AD, which was a long time ago, it was not okay for men to hurt women. That was not a normal thing. It was seen as a weakness and deficiency of character. It's not okay. So just to punctuate this point for Peter, to like really make this clear, especially this part about the physical abuse, And this might offend you. Take it up with Jesus. But the reference here to a weaker vessel seems to be Peter saying that on average, women are physically weaker than men. That is not always true. He's just saying on average that seems to be true. But for certain, societally and relationally, women had almost no power in first century Rome. And in that sense, they were definitely the weaker vessel. They did not have the capacity to defend themselves in the same way that men did. In fact, men were the only ones who could defend themselves, right? And so you just rolled with it. Be considerate, men, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing hinders your prayers. So again, to get back to this question that Peter has, how would Jesus handle a natural power imbalance like physical strength, right? If he were stronger than another person? Well, Peter is saying he would be considerate, he would show respect, he would be gracious, and he would treat them as an equal and a co-heir. That's good news. Like, that's great. That was not the norm of the day. So we just have to acknowledge the limitations of Scripture here, just to really point this out, that while Peter, in his writing to the churches, he cannot change the whole social order of Rome. He cannot make that happen. He's writing to real practical problems for people that he's leading. While he can't do that, he can instruct households to function in a way that spiritually levels the playing field. Everybody's in the same spot. He can place men, and he can place women, and he can place slaves, and he can place free people on the same place and make them co-heirs with Christ in terms of how they're supposed to be treated. And he can lead one another into deeper love of the mysterious Trinity in their actions and how they relate to one another. And so, for example, when he says to women, act this way so that your unbelieving husbands might be won over to Christ, the reason was because women were usually the first converts in first century Rome. It actually happened to females first in the household. And that was a good thing, and so that was the goal. And then for men, he's very clear, so that their prayers would not be hindered, right? So that the Father would actually hear them in the midst of that, because he is not going to hear them in the midst of injustice. And so, to be honest, I went into this with a lot of trepidation trying to figure this out. But what I've come to realize is that we can credit Peter's interpretation of Christ's suffering in his life, of his laying down of all of those things, as part of the reason why so much of this feels like such common sense to us in the 21st century. We can look at this and be like, oh, well, of course. Why wouldn't my wife be a co-heir and equal partner in my marriage? Why would I be able to treat people who work for me like trash, right? It might still happen from time to time, but the reason we're Peter needs to catch up to where we're at is because he laid the foundation for this, and that this has been used well in the church. There are two things I want to talk about in application that actually are still maybe not that easy for us in the 21st century, and maybe will bring us to a point where this is still very applicable. The first one is about what's called mutual submission when we teach about marriage. I'm sure these will pop up in a second. Mutual submission is found throughout the New Testament and other places that do talk about marriage. So, for example, the very famous Ephesians 5. Listen to these three passages, right? Ephesians 5:21 says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. There's that phrasing again, right? Reverence, fear, awe. And then you've got, just following it in 5:22, wives, specifically, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. And then again, 5:25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So submit to one another, wives submit to husbands, husbands love your wife, right? Peter and Paul are communicating the same thing, but they just have different goals. Peter's concern is actually social in this instance, right? So what he goes through in verses 3 through 6 is he's like, women, as you're getting ready to go to a worship service, for example. Again, remember, these are women who have no power in first century Rome. They're trying to figure this out. What they would end up doing is they would dress in their finest clothes, and then they would go to a complete stranger's house, and people would watch them do this, right? They would wear all of their finest stuff. There's an immediate assumption that the Romans were making about this, and it was essentially that the women were having an affair, right? Or this is where, like, the language that comes in the first century, if you've ever heard that the Romans thought the early Christians were having these love feasts, which was just communion, but they thought that they were like sexual escapades. This is part of that reality, right? Like, oh, all of these finely dressed women are going, because remember, there's no church buildings, they're meeting in houses. They're finely dressed, going to strangers' houses, and everyone's like, something weird is happening here, for sure. Something weird is happening. They want to look as nice as possible. This look to society that way. This does not, we would just kind of acknowledge on the surface that maybe this does not look the best for a like church that's only 20 years old, right? Maybe at this point. That like maybe this is not the best move, especially as they're actively being persecuted. It's like, it looks like the Christian faith is just upending social order in a weird way. And then similarly, Christian men who are running roughshod over their workers or over women, treating their servants like property, are not displaying the character of Christ, and they're giving the church a bad name. And so Paul, in these 3 passages of Ephesians, he agrees with Peter, and he's basing this, though, theologically on the personal transformation that occurs in marriage when it's done right, when you move into this as a new vocation. And he says it's the same thing, or should look the same, as Christ's oneness with the church, right? To be as one in marriage as Christ is one with his church, which, depending on your experience, might be really intense or not intense at all, right? But the goal is that Christ and we would be totally and completely one. And so out of that transformation, we submit to one another out of holy reverence, holy fear, holy awe, in the same way that you would say Jesus is your Lord for everything. I want to do everything the way that Jesus would teach me how to do it. That's the goal. And that's how we function in marriage. Now, here's the caveat. I don't know if you know this or not. Hope's not in the room. That's good. But my spouse is not all the way there yet. She's not like 100% like Jesus yet, right? Neither am I, by the way, of course. Those of you who know me, and most of you are thinking of your spouse like, no, I know, trust me. I would just simply say this. This is the most straightforward way I know how to say it. In the vocation of marriage, to the degree that you're right to not submit, like the right that you have to not submit, has more power than Jesus' character or your obedience to Jesus, your marriage is going to suffer. It will. And I'm not a very black and white person, but I would pretty much guarantee it. In the 21st century, to the degree that you have the right to do whatever you want or whatever, regardless of what Jesus says, your marriage is going to be tough. Right? Most of the time, there is more of Jesus in suffering well in marriage than in staging a rebellion, in trying to create a coup, in setting up some kind of secret interior life that your spouse doesn't know about, right? So you can have that. There is a great degree of humility in acknowledging that neither of you is probably the most fun person to be around all the time, right? Just acknowledging that is fine. You are on equal spiritual ground in marriage, and that's great. That's the goal. It means that you have to work things through together rather than leaning on stereotypes or assumptions of your culture, or doing this thing that I see happen a lot right now, where like one spouse, and this is a good thing, but like one spouse is doing a lot of like emotional spiritual work, and then there's like a bitterness that builds towards the other person who's not doing the work, right? And like there could be kind of like this weird anger that pops in. And I do think there's a natural reality to that. And I've felt it. But I guess what I'd want to say is that Thanksgiving, that your life is changing, is like a thumbs up. That would probably be the move. And maybe talking about some of those things. I understand that frustration. Because the alternative to that is treating your spouse how they deserve to be treated, right? Which is usually not the best. And this leads to war and strife and deception and rebellion, because they're people. They're not going to nail it 100% of the time. But because of the fall, that's our default. Our relationships are not going to be amazing. It's because of Jesus, really exclusively, that we can form marriages where our differences and our sinful tendencies, instead of dividing us, they actually become fuel for Christ's likeness. Like, we need to work through this together. We need to figure out what it looks like to display the character of Jesus. And I don't know if you've met people who have done that, but they are magnetic. You want to be around them. They are marriages that, rightfully so, they reflect the character and love of Jesus. And you're like, I want to be around those people, right? That's a good thing. But we need to let it be a fuel as opposed to a divider. And to be honest, the church often doesn't attract broken people because our relationships don't reflect the things that they actually need. If we can build marriages based on loving mutual submission, where we openly address our struggles, Paul says this shows the world a different way. It actually proves that God is real. However, it does take the Spirit's work to do that. The second thing I want to address, this will be the last thing, I want to address feelings. The role of feelings in marriage. In response to this, or in response to your spouse, I would guess that you are probably not going to feel like submitting the way that Jesus did. It would actually take a pretty tremendous amount of willpower to do this 100% of the time if you just based it on your feelings. This gets not a lot of time in Peter's work because feelings just didn't have the same level of power then as they do now. And that's fine. It's just a different time. Often our mismanaged desires, they win the day. And the desires that we listen to are the ones that make us feel good, right? The logic goes, if it feels good, it is good. If it feels bad, it is bad, right? That's kind of where our culture has landed. And so I would just say this again to kind of like say this as clearly as I know how. Many, if not most, of the fruits of a life with Christ come on the other side of healthily processing feelings, not in submission to feelings. You've got to go through feelings. You can't do whatever they tell you to do. And this takes a lot of training. But feelings make great servants, but they are horrific masters. Like, they will destroy you. Most of the time, the way that we feel about something is not the most accurate picture of that thing in reality. And what I've learned as a feeler, like I'm a heavy feeler. Like anybody in this room I'm in a relationship with, you could make me cry pretty quickly. You just have to say a couple of things. So I'm like, I feel that. What I've learned through that is that there must be a vision for my life that my feelings and desires submit to, or else they will destroy me. I have to have a vision that is greater than how I feel about things. They will lead me astray because my feelings almost never lead me to honest evaluation or to do really hard things, like really hard work. They always convince me I need to fight someone, I need to run away, or I'm going to freeze, or I'm going to give up, right? Those are pretty much the only ways that they're going to lead you most of the time. But if you think about the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, those come to us when we see things through, right? When we search through our emotions and find out what they are telling us truly. They're telling us messages like, I'm hurt. I need help. I actually am not competent enough to do this thing that I think I'm supposed to do. I want something to change. I am afraid. Believe it or not, those statements are incredibly powerful. They change the game, but most of us, when we are afraid, would not be able to just say, I think I'm afraid. Right? And usually they just feed us. The goal of those insights is not that you would blow everything up. The goal of those insights is that they would become prayer, right? If you read the Psalms, which I always suggest to people, that is the psalmist being as radically, transformatively vulnerable as humanly possible. Like, God, I don't think you're there. I'm not even sure you're real. I think you've abandoned me, right? Those are the things he's saying in the Psalms, which is supposed to be our prayer book in Scripture. And then it ends with post feelings. But Lord, I know you are good. I know you are working towards my good, and I will choose to trust you. That is the rhythm of the Psalms. And that there's a lot of room for that reality for all of us, and that is meant to mentor us in how we figure this out. Those feelings, the processing of those feelings are meant to fuel the intimacy we have with the Trinity, not blow it up. But instead to get their perspective. Lord, I feel afraid of this thing, but what do you think? Right? That's how we learn from Christ. That's how we take on his character. And the fruit of that, beyond just the specific fruit's name, there are characteristics that I go after in terms of vision that I know my feelings won't lead me to, right? Like, I know there is a world where I can be okay even when people around me are very not okay, right? Instead of taking on their feelings or getting anxious or trying to be a fixer, I can just be okay and be like, wow, that's crazy. I want that. I want that more than what I do now. But I know I have to go through things. I know I can be kind because I've seen it. I know that the saints of the church can be kind even in very unjust situations. And I would want that more than what I do now, which is usually to talk about them behind the back, right? I know there's a world where I can tell the truth in love, and people feel loved by me telling them the truth, and I want that. That you can hold others' needs above your own, even when it's hard. And I want that. I want that more than what I have now. And probably most importantly to me, that I could consciously choose those things instead of doing some of those behaviors just out of anxiety. Like, instead of just acting, but that they would be genuine overflows of my heart. I want that. I want that more than what I'm doing now. And so I know that processing my feelings will get me there because God is in it, but submitting to them will never get me there. Never, ever. But I think it would be good for all of us. So I just want to close as we pull this all together. There's a modern day mystic. His name is Frank Laubach. He was actually a politician and a bunch of other things, a missionary, super interesting guy. If you ever get a chance to grab a book called Letters by a Modern Mystic, I would really recommend it. He says this, and I think this is helpful. The simple program of Christ for winning the whole world is to make each person he touches magnetic enough with love to draw others. And so this is the tension we hold in both vocations, singleness and marriage, whatever. You doing your own work, figuring out how to work with another person, right? Jesus is trying to overflow love onto you so that it would transform you. It will make you a different person. And then at a certain point, that love overflowing onto you does overflow off of you and onto others. And there is a world that needs as much of that experience of love as humanly possible. They need all of it. And people who do that help people understand that Jesus really is real. That Jesus really does transform lives. That he really does make things different. That is our example. And there's a lot of philosophies that actually look like that and run counter to it. Nothing will replace just the experience of love that overflows onto others. Trying to get to Christ's character through disciplines or behaviors without love is not going to be a fun time. It's not going to be a good time for any of us. I wouldn't recommend it. But this, I think, if we were going to do one thing as a church, if there was going to be one we moment for all of us, my prayer for all of us, and I see it, my prayer for all of us is that we would be so drenched in the love that is transformative that people would be kicking down the doors to hear more about it. That would be my hope, because that's what happened to Jesus. So, I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll go into a little bit of some quiet time to reflect and to pray, and then we'll close our service. So, if you join me in prayer, I'd appreciate it. Jesus, I know there's a lot of things happening in this room.